Welcome to the Training Stimulus podcast. Today we are rejoined by our very special guest, Mr. Lewis Ferns, to do a deep dive on hinging. So I recently had a thought that hinging might not be as important as most of us think it is. And I'm kind of playing devil's advocate in this episode to explore the notion that we could be overestimating its importance for sport specifically. And yeah, you'll get all the details as you listen to the episode, but I thought it was a nice thought-provoking one to challenge some assumptions that we kind of take for granted as definitely true and absolute statements. And yeah, I'll leave it to you guys to make up your own mind as you listen to the episode. But as ever, if there are any other similar topics you'd love to see covered, please do get in touch. Details are in the description below. But let's get into the episode, guys. I hope you enjoy it. How are you, mate?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm a bit delicate, as you know.
Yeah.
I may well get a full body cramp in this podcast from a little bit of barley belly, but I'll try and hold it together. Yeah, so enough about that. The topic today is something we've discussed before, and it's how important is the hinge. And as a bit of context for the discussion, I think most people in fitness would agree that the hinge is one of the most important movement patterns, and it's taught as such. But I basically made an observation that a couple of good athletes I know, my kickboxing coach and my paddle coach, are terrible at hinging. And it just made me think that, are we placing more importance on it for everyone than it deserves? And yeah, I think that's a good little intro to the topic.
Yeah.
What was your knee-jerk response to that when I raised it?
I think because I've come from more of an injury background, and I've realised that the importance of having the option to hinge well, and believing that everyone needs to be able to hinge well to move optimally. But then it comes back to the point of, what are you optimizing for? Yeah, I think that's what I'd say. And you definitely will always want the option of being able to go there. But does that mean it requires, it requires a lot of your strength and conditioning training to be around the hinge? Is it that important? And from what I've spoke to you about, maybe not.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing about it for me, is that for the longest time, I would assume it's an essential thing to have in everybody's strength and conditioning program. And I still think it's very important and justifies taking up space for most people. But then, yeah, both these guys move really well, don't have any issues, and perform very well in their sports. But when they try to hinge, it's just like the body just doesn't know where to start, doesn't have much access to much length in the posterior hip. And it just got me thinking, like, they've got this far and perform at a very high level without even, I'd say, like a 1 out of 5 level hinge compared to people in the gym. And it, yeah, just sparked a lot of interesting thought for me around, is it a good use of their time to develop a really good hinge pattern? And what's the carryover like to their sports? Because in the gym, if we're deadlifting, if we're doing kettlebell swings, then there's obviously a huge carryover in that we get into that big hip hinge, deep hip flexion, want to access a good amount of internal rotation at the hips. But is that true in kickboxing? Is that true in paddle tennis or even normal tennis? And I think it's not that necessary. And these guys prove the point that they can still get by, performing at a very high level without needing to hinge very well.
Would concentrating on hinging, though, improve performance? If they are 1 out of 5, say, how much more performance could you eke out if they were stronger in that pattern?
Yeah.
I know it's arbitrary and hard to define. Or is it they need to hinge well in a kickstand hinge, a strict hinge, and just learn how to use that posterior hip more like a movement warm-up based scenario versus spending a lot of time getting strong in a hinge, but accessing it well in body weight
To give the option.
to give the option,
Yeah.
because that doesn't take that much time to learn. Because you don't need to, and the CNS isn't going to be that demanded. I mean, the CNS isn't going to be, taking a lot of load.
For them, I think they would. Like,
I
because I was teaching my paddle coach here, and his body had never been anywhere near it, which was what made me think, like, he's such a good mover, he's so good on core, but he doesn't have any capacity to, like, he would just always go into his knee or into his back completely, like more so than almost anyone I've seen in a gym scenario. And that's why I was like, this is fascinating, because he does cover the court so well. He's like known at the club for being so energetic and having great court coverage. So he can obviously do all the movements he needs to do for the sport. And I think having more movement options is always a good thing, all else being equal. But as we talk about a lot, all else is never equal. There's always a trade-off. So if he spends 15 minutes working on his hinge, it's at the expense of 15 minutes of something else, assuming he doesn't have unlimited time and recovery to train. And the thought process I went down is there an advantage to not going long in the glutes because of the positions and shapes that they get into in these sports? Like, actually having a shorter posterior hip might confer some advantages in that they are closer to extension faster. So because they're quite sports where you spend a lot of time on the ball of your feet, they actually want to get into hip extension very early. So by teaching the glute to lengthen more, do they miss out on some spring that they would get from having the shorter, tighter glute? Much like, most people would acknowledge that having short, tight calves can be really beneficial for jumping, like basketball players, etc.
And long, flat feet.
Exactly.
Closer to pronation and the stretch reflex.
Yeah. So that's what I started thinking of. If we got their glutes longer and looser, would they actually be a bit slower, especially when you're throwing a kick or something? You don't want to wind up so much to telegraph what you're about to do. Like, people always talk about Alex Pereira in the UFC, that you just never see his kicks coming because there's not much loading. So that means he's able to generate a lot of tension and power from a shorter muscle length than somebody else who is more telegraphed, and still hit hard. So yeah, I just thought it was very interesting. And what else were we saying about it?
But I think coming back to that point of they're coming from a short position, when we talk about kicks, the foot's usually externally rotated. They're also internally rotating from an externally rotated position, so they don't need as much internal rotation to get the load, if that makes sense. So, because you're saying that, the kickboxer and the paddle coach, they don't have a great deal of internal rotation, do they? But most times, is the sport usually biases an externally rotated foot position where they internally rotate from, versus when do they ever really land neutral or toe in?
Exactly.
Very rare.
Exactly that.
Because they can whip more from an external rotated position, versus you can't get much whip if you're already internally rotated.
Exactly right. Yeah. So I think that's a huge factor, that they're spending so much time in that externally rotated position that they're never getting into real internal rotation like you would do in a deadlift or a good bilateral hinge pattern. Your hips would achieve much more actual internal rotation at the finish position when the foot is more pronated than these sports, where if you think of a classic kickboxing stance, your toes are relatively out, staggered stance. Same for paddle tennis or tennis, you're standing relatively just shoulder width or just outside, with toes a little bit out, so you can go in either direction very easily. And like you say, you're never getting into that maximum length of the glute. And that leads me to think that being more quad and back dominant might actually be advantageous for the positions they spend most of their time in, because they don't want to be folding over, bringing the chest towards the floor. They want to be a little bit more upright so they can see what they're doing, especially if you're hitting an overhead shot in paddle. You obviously don't want to flex much at the hip. So actually keeping the hips forwards, using the knees and the back to generate power and movement could actually be better, which is, again, quite counter to the normal thought process for the gym, where most people are like, use your hip as much as possible. And obviously using your hips is great, and I would never stop somebody learning to use their hips. But yeah, I just think it's a really interesting discussion to poke at the assumption that the hinge is essential for everybody. Yeah.
If we rolled with that, and now your kickboxing coach or paddle coach now has a low back problem, and then you assess, and you're like, oh, there's a clear missing movement quality, is the posterior hip doesn't lengthen and stabilize very well, you're likely to plug that hole because you think, well, that's some low-hanging fruit we can concentrate on here, and we can bring that up to a certain level. Is that, would you agree with that, or you think,
Yeah, for sure. Like, what do we always say? Like, it's not a problem unless it's a problem.
Yeah.
So once it becomes a problem, then yeah, if that lower back is doing more than the body can handle, bringing in some reinforcements from the posterior hip, I think, would be a good idea. But I think it's just an interesting challenge to my own thought process. And we were talking about this earlier. I likened it to carbs in that it's not actually essential. You can survive without carbs, but they do offer an advantage to performance. So these guys have been living a hinge-free life, and if we give them a bit of hinging, then maybe that can improve their output. But they've obviously got by fine for, well, the paddle guy's in his 30s, without ever really accessing that posterior hip to full length.
If you think about the elites, though, do you think they can, or do you see them using the posterior hip more? Do you reckon there's a ceiling of not being able to use your posterior hip at these intermediate level? If you call in like the UFC guys and the Wimbledon guys, they're elite. Do you reckon they do have the access? Because is there a ceiling to not being able to, use your posterior hip?
That's a really good question. I think, I don't know is the answer. I would love to obviously do assessments on the best athletes in the world and see. If I had to bet, I would say there would be some that still can't hinge at the highest level. Just from my experience working with sportsmen, the people who are the best at their sport usually play the sport the most, and it's not because they have the widest range of movement options, it's because they dominate the few movement options they have, which are most relevant to playing that sport. And I think it surprises a lot of people when I say stuff like that I'm not pushing people to move as well as possible. It's moving as well as necessary to train and play like you want to as well as possible. So the outcome is always the performance in the sport. That's what we're optimizing for. And having all the movement options in the world and perfectly balanced and no dysfunction whatsoever, if you pursue that route, it will be at the expense of your sport training and sporting performance beyond a certain point. Obviously, we want to avoid injuries and optimize power and output, but it goes beyond the point where you can, imagine if you're working on a pistol squat or something like that. It's cool and it's nice and it's cool. Yeah, it's cool that you can do it, but in either of those sports, it's completely redundant. So you've spent time, energy, and recovery capacity on something that doesn't have the best return on time invested. And when you are at an elite level, you're always trying to get edges on your competitors. So if you're investing time in a pistol squat and you're the guy who's working on his head kick, like, it's just a much better use of time.
Yeah. I think mobility is quite a black and white example for this. And a lot of my clients have previously asked what extra mobility stuff they can do. And most of the time they're mobile enough for their sport, or they're mobile enough for what they want to do, but they just think more mobility just means less pain or more gains or something. And you can spend a lot of time becoming more mobile, but it doesn't actually help performance. And I think that's a very black and white way of seeing it. Posterior hip function is like harder to define.
Yeah.
Because it's more in performance than it is in metrics of, oh, you can flex your hip this much and internally rotate this much.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I think, just what would be the metrics for determining if somebody's training was impacting their performance? You know, if somebody was using the force, I don't know what it's called, when, you know, they have the force measuring.
Yeah, the VLAD. The VALD, VLAD? The force plates? No.
Well, the force plates, you know, when they measure who's got the hardest punch in the world.
Oh, yeah.
And they do the same with kicks. And if you measured that before and after a block of hinge work, that would be really interesting to see what the outcome is. Or if you had some sort of speed and agility test, if somebody loaded their hips more rather than their calves, quad and back, would they perform better in sport-specific test? And yeah, it's very hard to measure and control, you know, what would be the alternative if they just did more sport-specific training. And we were talking about this as well, just how most strength and conditioning coaches overestimate the benefit of strength and conditioning for specific sports because it's their job. And I think most people I'd probably overestimate the benefit of movement mechanics because it's what I work in. It's just a natural human bias. But what were we talking about? Oh, we're talking about Joseph Chen, who I bumped into. He's a world-class jiu-jitsu player, and he was telling me about his conditioning work, which would be sparring intervals from the hardest and most sapping positions. So he'd essentially put himself in a really disadvantaged position, which required a lot of effort to get out of. And as soon as he gets out of it, he goes back into it for time intervals, much like you would do cardio intervals. But because he's using the exact same movement patterns, the exact same breathing patterns that he would do in the sport, the carryover was just far more profound than when he used to do assault bike intervals and stuff like that. And I thought that was just a beautiful example of how we should start with the sport and take one step away to focus on the training stimulus, rather than start with the training stimulus and take a small step towards the sport. And yeah, from what he told me, he found it far, far more beneficial to approach it like that. And so that's why when I'm talking about hinge stuff, when we get somebody to hinge, we're starting with a strength and conditioning training stimulus that we want. But there's potentially a big distance between how the hip is used in the sport. So would we be better off focusing on rotating your pelvis to generate more force when you're kicking? Would we focus more on doing shuttle runs and speed, agility, quickness stuff for paddle tennis to cover the court and generating, or doing plyos, multi-directional plyos, because that generates strength and power in the hips, more relevant to paddle tennis?
Yeah.
And I would argue, yes, that will be better for sports performance than just working on hinging, because there's a few more gaps to plug before the body can connect the dots between that movement pattern and the movement pattern used in the sport.
Yeah, and less taxing than the CNS. I think before I got mixed up, because I've done assessments and I've got people to do maybe 3 reps of a hinge base exercise, and they've texted me the next day and they've got DOMs, and that's pretty much all we did after the assessment. And it just shows if you are truly missing that movement quality and you do load it, it doesn't take a lot of load to have muscle soreness and to get the fibers recruited, and it feels very tiring as well. It feels like you've done a lot of work because your CNS is actually working very hard to figure out the problem or solve the problem you're trying to put the body into. So doing like plyos, which is being reactive from those short positions, which usually is in their sport anyway, I can imagine that they'd be able to do more load and recover from it sooner than they would in a larger lengthened position.
Yeah, I agree. Like when you ask somebody to go very far out of their comfort zone, it's more taxing and probably takes longer to recover from as well. But one thing we were talking about earlier is that when is it useful or a better decision to be less specific to the sporting movements. What would you say?
And we've done a lot of talking previously, as you can imagine. But essentially, with Joseph Chen, and he's been very specific with his conditioning, there is a lot of brain power going into that, because he is actually trying to get out of a position which is very difficult, and there's a lot of coordination involved, and they're two very taxing things. So if the body is very beat up, then we was talking about the England rugby team where they would do their anaerobic stuff on a watt bike because it's just less impact for the joint and less stressful. So if they could do, 8 seconds all out 100% max effort sprint on an air bike or a watt bike versus an 8-second sprint over land, the demand is much, much higher from over land. And if they're doing so much land-based training with their, rucks and whatever else, then you would need to take it back a step so they can still achieve the training stimulus, but not at the expense of something else, and still get that anaerobic booster, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation. It's like they're already accumulating a lot of time on feet on the pitch. They're already doing their running, their agility work. So if they're also doing their cardio and their conditioning stuff on feet, that's gonna be more stress on the joints, more impact, and especially during the season when they're playing matches, you want to probably reduce the amount of impact as much as you can because you're getting a lot of it every weekend. So like you said, you can achieve the cardiovascular stimulus without the impact, which is slightly less specific. Like doing the running intervals would carry over more to playing rugby, but the cost and the injury risk increase. The coaches have made a decision that it's not worth the specificity. They'd rather be slightly less specific, still get the cardiovascular response, and save the...
I think, from my understanding, that's why a lot of S&C coaches and coaches they clash, they bash heads, because I think the traditional coaches just want them playing more sport, and the S&C guys are wanting to do more gym-based work. And I think there's a fine balance between the two, and I don't think they often agree, especially when they're trying to return an athlete from injury. But yeah, I don't really have much insight to that world, but I think from an outside looking in, that's what it looks like.
Yeah, I'd agree. Everybody always wants to do their stuff, right? They want to increase the importance of their speciality, and that's natural. But yeah, I think this is why it's a great thing to talk about, because we don't know for sure. People are doing different balances. There are some people that just play the sport and do, Michael Phelps didn't do any weightlifting until his second Olympics, and he cleaned up in his first Olympics. So he's clearly able to perform at the highest level without formal strength and conditioning. When he added strength and conditioning, he did even better in his second Olympics. But we can never run the experiment of, if he just continued doing swimming and not lifting weights, would he have been able to perform? Maybe with 4 more years of training, he could have performed at that level anyway, and potentially the S&C made him worse. We'll never know. We can debate it to the end of days, but I think that's why it makes such an interesting discussion, that running a proper experiment to determine the most effective protocols and balance between sport-specific and classic strength and conditioning is so difficult, because you can never run the experiment, and the outputs are hard to measure, especially in competitive sport, because you're measuring yourself against others and they're not constant variables that are easy to track.
I think we all love broad statements. It's like, this is the best.
Yeah.
Doing like hinging is the best. Doing S&C for this is the best. But yeah, it all comes down to the person in front of you and what they're trying to achieve and what they're presenting with. And it's the answer no one really likes, is like, it depends.
Yeah.
But it is true. But yeah, there is some principles you can fall back on based on assessment.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, elevator pitch. How important is the hinge?
I would still say very important, but it still depends. And if it's going to take away from someone's end goal, then there's no need spending time on it, unless it becomes, a problem.
Yeah, good answer. I'd say very important, but not essential. It's probably for many athletes. If you do a sport involving hinging, then it's obviously essential.
Mm-hmm.
But my new stance on it, in light of these thoughts, is that you don't need to get every field sport athlete who's not competing in a barbell sport to dedicate huge amounts of time to a hinge. It could still be beneficial, and it probably is still beneficial for most people, but I'm sort of removing the essential label in my mind.
If they're in pain, is it a non-negotiable then?
If they have...
If it's missing?
If it's missing and they're in pain, and I think the fact they're in pain relates to the fact that it's missing, then yes.
Yeah.
Like your example, if the back is overloaded because they're overextending from the back because their hip isn't contributing very much, then yeah, I would look to get some more load through there. However, I think this is probably another thing I didn't say, is that I think they're still very good at getting hip extension, even though they don't access deep ranges of hip flexion. Because if you look at kicks and you look at going overhead in racket sports, there's great global extension. If you think about somebody winding up for a smash, their whole anterior chain is really nicely lengthened, including their hip. So they are able to shorten the glute. They're just not necessarily lengthening it very much. And the same in kickboxing. Somebody's doing a front kick, their standing leg gets into a larger degree of hip extension. So they are still loading the hip and using the hip to generate force, but they just don't go into the deep ranges of hip flexion that a hinge trains. So yeah, there's a lot of nuance around it, but at least we find it interesting. Hopefully you guys did too. I think that's a nice place to leave it. Anything else to add?
Nope.
No. All right. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time. So there we have it. Is hinging overrated? We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you are watching or listening on YouTube, please drop a comment to let us know what you think. But hopefully it's a little bit of food for thought to challenge the default assumptions of the industry. And yeah, maybe you could take that thought process into other areas and different movements. But that's all for today, guys. Thank you for your time and attention. And as ever, if you are interested in learning more about movement mechanics, please do check out thetrainingstimulus.com. There's a ton of free resources there, including access to our free school community with a huge wealth of free educational material. Until next week, guys, have a good one, and we'll catch you next time around.